ask you to keep your microphones on mute during the webinar to avoid any feedback issues and background noise. That would be great. If you do hear a muffled happy birthday being sung here, that's my children washing their hands. We do want to hear from you. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end. Please also use the chat function on Zoom if it's easier to log any questions you may have. And for those of you who have just joined us, welcome. And to kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Winnie Ye, lead platform acceleration at the World Economic Forum. Winnie leads the IUU and Traceability Action Track of the Forum's Friends of Ocean Actions initiative. So over to you, Winnie, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. And good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Tom, could you go on to the next slide? I want to talk a little about the IUU. Did you know that a lot of the seafood we eat today still come from illegal, unregulated, or unreported fishing? Even today, consumers often cannot tell if the fish they eat was legally caught. And here on the screen, you can see a few statistics we've pulled together from different reports on the illegal fishing front. This causes the annual loss of diversion of fish from the legitimate trade system is 26 to 50 billion US dollars. It's a big financial cost to the businesses and country's GDP. And because of that, almost 30% of the world's fisheries are overexploited. And up to 32% of the seafood imported to the US is caught illegally. Because of many of this and not enough transparency in the seafood supply chain, consumers often cannot tell if the fish they eat was caught legally. And in today's world where consumers are increasingly caring more about the sustainability and social responsibility of the products and food they buy, this is becoming increasingly important. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Because of this, the World Economic Forum has convened the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration. This declaration was convened back in 2017 at the United Nations Ocean Conference. The point of this declaration is to leverage the power of partnerships, supporting the SDG 14 and SDG 17. SDG 14.4 has a goal to eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. One way of achieving this goal is to improve the traceability and transparency of the seafood supply chain. This will be able to enable scaling of existing sustainability and social initiatives. Currently, because of the lack of transparency, it is difficult for consumers to know if the fish, not just legally sourced, but if it is coming from a sustainably managed fisheries or the supply chain has fair labor practices. This declaration has 66 companies that has signed in, and 6 governments and 21 civil society organizations supporting the declaration. The goal is to use the positive power of public-private collaboration to catalyze the elimination of illegal fishing. Could you go on the next? Thank you. The Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration has 4 commitments. It is the traceability commitment, the commitment to a socially responsible tuna supply chain, and commitment to environmentally responsible tuna sources and government partnership. Each of the 66 companies that have signed on have committed to achieve these 4 commitments. The tuna traceability commitment is having fully traceable tuna products from vessel to the point of sale and have the information to be disclosed to consumer upon request at the point of sale. And secondly, a socially responsible tuna supply chain. Companies have pledged to eliminate any form of slavery and ensure that suppliers at least meet minimum social standards defined by the International Labour Organization. And thirdly, companies are committed to using environmentally responsible tuna sources. These are sources that have robust science-based management plans, and also sources that have measures to ensure that impact of fisheries on the environment is sustainable. Lastly, companies are committed to partner with governments in achieving the top three. Companies will call on governments to take actions to implement harvest strategies by collaborating with the RFMO, the Regional Fisheries Management Organization, and calling on governments to establish systems to identify and restrict illegal seafood, as well as building capacity to establish and manage information systems. These four commitments together make up the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration commitment. And traceability and transparency is one that can underpin achieving the socially sustainable tuna supply chain and environmentally responsible tuna sources. Without traceability, it is difficult to know whether or not a socially responsible or environmentally sustainable tuna supply chain exists. So thank you for signing on to the Tuna Traceability Declaration and for supporting the declaration. Tom, back to you, and back to you to talk about the progress report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. So, so that's the overview of the Tuna Traceability Declaration. So how does the Global Tuna Alliance, or the GTA, fit in with this? Well, the GTA, first of all, it's worth describing. We're an independent group of retailers and supply chain companies with a shared goal of tuna in the supply chains that meets the highest levels of performance, both of environmental and social responsibility. So it's kind of a shared goal that aligns very well with the Tuna 2020 Declaration commitments. Now, the GTA was originally established about 3 years ago, and in response to the fact that the regional fishery management organizations, or RFMOs, were not managing, or still not managing, tuna fisheries properly, is probably a fair way to describe it. And this is having an impact on supply chain seafood sourcing commitments. No matter what you do at the vessel level or with a fishery, if the actual management of the fishery by these RFMOs are not done properly, then you're never going to achieve those goals of environmental sustainability. Plus, if you don't have things like effective monitoring, control and surveillance, observer coverage, you're really going to struggle on the traceability and the transparency aspects. So the key here was the RFMOs. And you can see there is an overlap with some of the government partnership work here. And what happened was discussions between the Global Tuna Alliance and the World Economic Forum has led to an arrangement where the Global Tuna Alliance is fully funded through the Friends of Ocean Action Initiative to implement the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration commitments. And the diagram on the right sort of shows the kind of the arrangement that we've got and how we work together. It's a very good and a very strong partnership. And what we do is using our shared strengths to help companies who have signed the declaration really advance with meeting the commitments. This is the current suite of partners in the Global Tuna Alliance. We're very much Northwest European centric at the moment. That's not through design. We are looking to expand globally, of course, to go with the name. Some of these companies are Tuna Traceability Declaration signatories themselves. Others aren't. That's down to individual business choice, but we are fully supportive of the scale and the scope of the declaration commitments. So how are we going? How are we looking at the progress report? How do we get there? Well, an online survey was developed by the Global Tuna Alliance and circulated to all the signatories in order to learn how they have been addressing the 4 commitments in the declaration. This was back in October, started, and we ran it until the end of January. The results have been used to generate a progress report, which is essentially what we're going to be talking about on the webinar, where examples of best practice are highlighted, where the commitments have been achieved, the methods, systems and processes used by companies to achieve that, and can be used as route maps for success. The report's also given us a great gap analysis of where signatories to the declaration have not yet been able to meet the commitments. And this has been used for us to strategize and develop a support and outreach strategy to address these issues. So this presentation, what we're going to do for the rest of it is really highlight the key findings and the summaries of it. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail on everything. We will be producing a progress report that will be published next week that will have all the information. So this is really the sort of the taster. This is a list of the Tuna traceability declarations and those who've responded to the survey and those who didn't. It's really just to show you the scale of the companies that have responded. It's a shame that not everyone responded. I totally understand that people have a lot on at the minute, for example. But we have been having conversations with a couple of these companies who have originally didn't sign on, but do or will be working with us to create their own dashboards as well. So we're chipping away at this, and we do hope that all the companies, all the signatories are going to respond to the final survey at the end of the year. So this graphic here shows where the survey respondees are based. For the sort of the big international companies, I've used the HQ location just for convenience. But you can see the majority of the supply chain respondees were from Europe, with the remainder distributed across the USA, Southeast Asia and Australia, and we had one in South Africa. Within Europe, the respondees are primarily from the UK and Spain. And a lot of this is to do with the fact that the companies who signed on are also from these areas. In terms of the sector from which the respondees identify themselves, the most common sector represented was the processors, followed by the distributors, that's the truck, then the fishers themselves, the fisheries, which is the fishing vessel. Several respondees signified that they're from more than one part of the chain. Hence, we have 41 answers from the 34 responses, just in case you're very quick at maths. I want to know why there's a discrepancy. Rather than try to have separate categories of people who say they were a processor distributor or a food service and retail, what we've done is we've just said people have ticked twice, we've counted them in both categories, just for ease and consistency. This chart here looks at the expected business benefits or liabilities for signing on or achieving the 2020 Traceability Declaration commitment, so actually meeting all the commitments. As you can see, there was an overwhelmingly positive expectation from supply chain signatories to the declaration. I don't think that's really to be unexpected, otherwise they may not have signed on. However, what was interesting was there was a conformity of key expected benefits, which were publicity, brand awareness, and improved supplier relations. And that was across all the sectors. The potential liabilities signified in red are really fiscally focused, reduced revenue, and increased costs. And I think that's, people weren't necessarily saying, you know, this is incredibly bad and, you know, it shouldn't be happening. People were understanding that there may be increased costs that come with some of these measures, but it was ultimately for the right reasons. One company, only one, a processor, was concerned by a potential decline in supplier relationship and interaction. And it was interesting because we couldn't get to the bottom of why in their narrative, but I'm guessing it may be due to increased administrative or logistical burden. And it's certainly something that will be worth expanding upon this question in the final survey. So what have we done with all the answers from the questions? I've just touched on some of the, you know, a bit of the background here, but what have we done with the answers themselves? Well, the progress survey included questions on how companies were progressing in meeting each commitment. So it was self-reporting. So how are you progressing on the traceability commitment? And we gave set answers. You can see there on this dashboard here. To capture all the data from the surveys, we developed these anonymized progress dashboards. There'll be one for each responding company in this format. This is just a blank template. The answers were collated to provide a very quick visual reference to highlight the areas where progress has been strong and areas where progress has been limited or less developed. And so this is how it would look. So you scratch off the processor. They have their signatory reference number there, so it's totally anonymized. These are based, you scratch off the answers, and they're color coded with red, amber, green. You can see the traceability information is disclosed at point of sale. Moving on to social responsibility, some of the tuna supply chain is free of slavery. A question about suppliers. Moving on to the environmental sustainability, about your pledges or your seafood sourcing commitments, the amount of tuna you sell that's GSSI or certified by a GSSI recognized certification scheme. And then finally, on to government partnerships. How have you, have you engaged and supported advocacy efforts for the following areas? And you can see there. And so this is what you'd get for if you're a company who'd received this. And this is self-reported. So this is based on the information that you've provided. And what it's intended to do is give you a very quick snapshot of areas that you may have to work on to meet the commitment. The bottom left is the overall performance score. To provide a series of metrics of how each company is progressing in meeting the commitments based on their self-reporting, a series of performance scores were developed and presented on each dashboard, and I've highlighted them here on the left. For each commitment, a percentage score was calculated using this very simple scoring system on the right. There was no weighting of each commitment or each answer of each commitment. You can see on the left, and we just averaged them out to give it an overall performance score. We've also used a simple red, amber, green labeling system used essentially to visually differentiate high, medium, low scores. And that's based on the less than equal to 33% is a red, greater or equal to 66% is a green, and everything else is an amber. So you can get a quick look at the performance there. So using this template, how would that look using these dummy answers? You can see for traceability, they would score 80%, social 30%, environmental sustainability 55%, and government partnerships 25%. And that will give us an overall performance rating of 48%. So these dashboards have been produced for all of the companies that responded to the progress survey. They are going to be individually circulated following the webinar, so either later today or tomorrow. So each company will receive their own one of these. They will also be published in the progress report, but just stressing again, they're fully anonymous. So based on all these dashboards, we're able to collate them and actually get some information about the responses across the supply chain. This chart shows the average performance scores. So just to jot back, this is the overall performance score we're looking at here. So it's the average performance score for each commitment and overall by supply chain sector. You can see the overall average performance scores by sector show a clear pattern of decreasing score from traceability to social to environmental to government partnerships. And there's, well, apart from a little blip for food service, but there were only 2 companies in that sector, so it was easily skewed. You can see there was also a pattern of decreasing average scores up the supply chain from fishery or point of harvest up towards the consumer. So you can see each of the lines dropping down in each one. This chart here shows the range of individual overall performance scores. This is the overall performance score, and this graph here is just showing the range of scores, so just the distribution there. You can see the average overall performance score by sector does show a clear pattern of decreasing score from traceability to social responsibility again. The range increases up the supply chain from harvest, and this may be due to the producers in question, the fisheries here, having to respond to the highest bar. So if they have to respond to one particular bar by their customer, then all the product they do may meet that bar. So there's less range. It's unclear at this point, but this is just some speculation of why we're seeing this increased range across the supply chain. This hypothesis is actually borne out by the range of traceability performance scores by sector, which again shows an increasing range or increasing distribution of scores as we move along the supply chain. It's also the case with social responsibility. So you can see the range is actually increasing as we move across. And this isn't just due to increased numbers, because for fishery and processors, for example, there are more. There's a couple of examples here where there's multiple hits behind each of the dots. However, that hypothesis of ours is not actually supported by the range of environmental sustainability performance scores by each sector, which does show a similarly wide performance rating across each sector, which is unlike the previous 2 graphs. I mean, the consistent range may be due to the fact that it could well be the same products that are progressing through the supply chain. We are talking about, not necessarily a limited pool of people here, but we are talking about some big companies who are supplying a lot of the market. So we could just be seeing this transfer across the supply chain. The government partnership performance scores also shows a similar wide range across each sector. However, the government partnership commitment at the moment is not linked to many sourcing requirements at all. So it's difficult to sort of categorize that in the same way as we have done previously. But it does provide a useful measure of how different companies are performing against this commitment. You can see some are very much engaged, certainly at the fishery end, less so as we progress across the supply chain. Now, the following slides look in more detail at the progress being reported in meeting each commitment. So previous ones are just sort of distribution of scores. This is when we actually get to the answers in the self-reporting. So this slide shows the progress reported in meeting the overarching aim of the traceability commitment. All respondees noted they were making good progress in meeting this commitment, with all fishery, distributor and food service companies reporting that tuna products in their supply chain are already traceable to vessel and trip dates. 2 retailers themselves noted they're in the process of making tuna products in their supply chain traceable, with the remaining responses from this category reporting that tuna products in their supply chain are traceable to fisheries, but not necessarily to vessel and trip dates. No company stated that tuna products in their supply chain are not yet traceable, and they have no plans to address this. So this is very reassuring to see such a level of progress in this traceability commitment. The second part of this commitment is the information disclosed to the consumer at point of sale. And the responses were similarly positive, with the majority of the answers, as you can see, yes or working on it, although noticeably proportionately less with retailers. It may be that the further away you are from the point of harvest, the lower of the proportion of products that will actually meet this. Is this due to the wider range of products that the retailers and food service companies are supplying to their customers compared to people lower down in the supply chain? Another factor could be that the supply chain is much longer by this point, and there are many more nodes that need to be traced. There's more complexity. It's unclear, but we are hopeful that the recent launch of the GDST standards are something that can greatly help reduce the complexity here, and hopefully sort of join the gaps on this, because the information is obviously available at the start of the chain. In terms of social responsibility, you can see on this graph here, nearly 2/3 of companies, 61%, believe their tuna supply chains are slave-free. And I just want to note here that the term slave-free is the term that's used in the original commitment. I think all of us agree that if we could revisit that, we would change the language to be more inclusive of wider social responsibility issues such as debt bondage, human rights abuses. It's unfortunate that that's the language that is being used, but we've used it continually here for consistency. It's just to flag that we're not being blinkered about one particular important aspect of social responsibility. So 2/3 believe their tuna supply chains are slave-free, and 17%, so that's nearly 1 in 5, have third-party certification to demonstrate this. As we progress through the supply chain further from point of harvest, we find that the distribution of responses change, and there is a decrease in the number of responses reporting slave-free tuna supply chains, and an increase in the level of uncertainty. This pattern is also reflected in the proportion of suppliers of tuna products that at least meet the minimum social standards. Which is the next graph. This is unsurprising, as there will be undoubtedly be a cascade effect up the supply chain. So if there is a break in the chain, you can imagine it's going to cascade along it. Several respondees did add further narrative in their answers. There was, in all the answers, there is an opportunity to add narrative. So several respondees did use this that describe their activities and achievements in meeting the commitment here. Several companies note that they have really good systems in place on land, in processing plants, etc., but they really are struggling with the at-sea proportion of the supply chain. The verification issues there was oft repeated. Several companies note that they're working with vessel-based standards. The Seafood Task Force was mentioned a few times on their tuna vessel standard, while others have their own in-house processes. In terms of the suppliers, as I mentioned before, the pattern in the previous slide is sort of carried over into this one, which again is not surprising when you consider it, you know, we're talking about their suppliers. You know, as I said, there would be a cascade effect. So it's probably not the most useful set of data there is. In terms of the environmental sustainability requirements here, the question we asked here was, do your sourcing priorities, do your sourcing commitments contain requirements for the blue, which is the robust science-based management plans, and the orange, which is more about the wider ecosystem impacts of the fisheries themselves. So you're not just looking at stock size or management plans, you're looking at the wider impact. So to have both would be what we're looking for here. And as you can see, there is very few, I think it was only one retailer didn't have any of them at the moment, but they did note that this was a new area for them and they were working on developing it. But you can see the majority of people actually have both. But the commitments there, so that would be fully meeting the environmental sustainability commitment, whilst others were looking at one or two of the other areas. To achieve the commitment, 5 companies, so just over 20%, have pledged to source tuna fisheries, source from tuna fisheries that implemented science-based management plans. 12 have got it just from the wider ecosystem things as well. But if you actually break it down into the average percentages of companies that are sourcing tuna from GSSI recognized ones, and of course this aligns with the previous side of things, both of these commitments would, you know, in a certification frame, would meet GSSI benchmarking. You can see only 3 companies currently source 100% of their tuna from fisheries certified by schemes that are benchmarked by GSI. 1 fishery, 1 processor, 1 distributor. This doesn't show it on this graph here, it's just these are the average scores. 20 companies actually source less than 10% at the minute, and the overall average is 34%. But when you consider that the global average of tuna production that's in GSSI recognized certification is only 24.5%, I would say that the companies responding are actually doing better than the global average. I don't know whether that's a useful statistic, but it's something that was of interest to me. The average percentage of tuna source sold by schemes recognized by GSA is relatively consistent between fisheries processors and distributors, as you can see there. There is a slight drop with retailers, but a large increase with food service. It might be the range of products sold here. For example, the food service companies may be selling a high proportion of skipjack, which is proportionately more MSC certified than other tuna species. Government partnerships, this is the final commitment. This was the lowest scoring performance by each of the supply chain sectors and overall. This chart shows the overall support for advocacy efforts identified in the declaration, and the results are pretty clear. Advocacy for the development of harvest control rules and harvest strategies was the only area where companies have engaged in any significant way. With the exception of 1 company that reported some, well, very clear advocacy work on ILO. So with the exception of that, it really was the harvest strategies was the only area where we're seeing any significant advocacy work by members of the supply chain. This may be explained by the lack of seafood NGOs with market partners working on some of these areas. If you take harvest strategies and harvest control rules, this is an area that NGOs with market partners are working on through the Global NGO Tuna Forum. This is also an area where ISSF are very active on. It's also an area where GTA is active on as well. So you have a number of partners with access to this information. The Port States Measures Agreement, PSMA, one of the few NGOs that are working on this quite substantially is Pew, and Pew doesn't have any market partners. We are actually working with Pew on building the toolkit for this, on how we can use their excellent resources to provide to supply chain companies, so we can actually start to see that kind of advocacy effort we're seeing with harvest strategies and control rules. The same again is with the global record of fishing vessels. We're seeing very little communication out there from the global record themselves. I have asked them for, what is it you'd like to see companies do to get involved? And they've very kindly given me a list of actions that will be used in the toolkit we're producing. This chart here captures the challenges and obstacles that respondees encountered when working on meeting each of the commitments. While each commitment has its own unique footprint of challenges, the traceability commitment was found to have much fewer than anything else. And you can see it scores highest on little or no obstacles. And yet the social responsibility commitment was found to be complex. The environmental sustainability commitment was found to have external stakeholder resistance, and the lack of personnel was really hindering meeting the government partnership commitment. So, we've tried to drill into this a little bit more on the next couple of slides. So this is focusing on the traceability commitment. Traceability scores highly on little or no obstacles, and this probably reflects the long time frame that companies have been working on seafood traceability, which are required under general food laws. This is not just about sustainability, for example. When the responses to this question are analysed by the sector of the supply chain, we find that the earlier steps in the chain reported little or no obstacles more frequently. Possibly due to the shorter distance from the vessel. It's also possible that because several of the respondees are participating companies in ISSF, and ISSF does have a specific traceability conservation measure for traceability that requires companies to demonstrate the ability to trace products from can code or sales invoice to vessel and trip. So they're very much set up to do this. The later steps in the chain really found lack of personnel to be a greater obstacle. And this may be possibly reflecting the vast diversity of products they source. And it's just the fact that it's further up the supply chain, it's more complex and requires more personnel to work on it. Difficult to get to the exact bottom of this one. The social responsibility challenges, it's understandable that complexity was a common primary challenge meeting this commitment. That's over the past few decades, while significant resources have been invested in environmental sustainability of seafood, social responsibility in seafood is relatively new. The complexity likely stems from the breadth of the issue, which, as I mentioned, is not just slavery. It includes coercive treatment of both sea and land-based workers, abusive labour and recruitment practices, forced and bonded labour, human trafficking, child labour, and it also affects a large range of countries and a wide range of products. It's not just a very localised issue. But when the responses to this question are analysed by sector of the supply chain, we found that complexity was the only obstacle reported by all sectors of the supply chain. For the environmental sustainability, there was a clear divergence in the challenges and obstacles in meeting this commitment. There was a sort of a break between fishers, processors and distributors versus retail and food service. The former reported that external stakeholder resistance was the primary issue, whereas the latters were generally experiencing little or no obstacles. Why is this? Well, we postulate that it's the significant resources that I mentioned previously that have been invested in environmental sustainability of seafood by NGOs, for example, and they tend to be targeted at retail and food service sectors. And this has probably provided the support, the foundation for these sectors to meet this commitment reasonably easily. For those downstream supply chain actors, sourcing can maybe be switched to producers that meet in-house requirements. And also you've got the expansion of FIPS and APES, obviously less relevant with tuna, provides further opportunities for them to meet their own commitments. However, the closer you are to the product, the less flexibility you have. You are fishing a particular resource. And the fishers are the most reliant on external factors. And when we get to the external stakeholder resistance, it could be that these external stakeholder resistant issues reported in the survey, it may be things like lack of management. It could be the external stakeholders who are managing the fishery that are holding people back in meeting their sustainability commitments. Lack of personnel was the key obstacle preventing respondees across the supply chain from meeting the government partnership commitment. I mentioned that, and it's one that was reflected across all the supply chain areas. Other also scored highly, and when we explored this in the narrative, this was all concerned with a lack of leverage as a single company. So companies saying, the reason we can't do this is we can't do it on our own. We do not have the strength in our voice to actually effect change. Lack of personnel and leverage concerns are real interesting obstacles in this area, as many companies do have government relations teams or staff, or are members of representative organisations, Europesh, FMI, APC, and these could be avenues for representation with governments, or RFMOs and delegations. It may be that there's a disconnect between the needs of the CSR teams, the people responsible for seafood, and the priorities of the company's government relation teams, where they have them. Furthermore, some of the issues discussed in this commitment, Port State Measures Agreement, Global Record of Fishing Vessels, they are relatively new areas of advocacy, and the lack of personnel may be reflecting a lag or even capacity limits for what is an increasingly complex set of asks. So what about the support? When asked what support is required to achieve each commitment, we did see a lot of alignment here. For the traceability commitment, excuse me, a number of things, excuse me, for traceability, whilst there was a general high performance of respondees meeting this commitment, a number of themes did emerge, as you can see up on the slide. 4 separate companies themselves requested interoperability support, which concerns the seamless, secure exchange of data between companies and the applications they use, which is exactly what the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability is looking at. So it was very clear that the transfer of the data was something that people were concerned about. Some people did refer to the GDST explicitly and said, this is what we're waiting for. Others were more, maybe they were just aware of the problems, but not the potential solutions. So that was a very clear primary support area. As noted in the obstacles and challenges slide, the later steps in the chain found the lack of personnel to be a greater obstacle, possibly reflecting the diversity of products they source and sell. But once there is a standardized traceability method with key data elements, it should make this traceability easier, as companies can far more easily consolidate and use upstream data for more traceability. When asked what support is required to achieve the social responsibility commitment, responses again converged around a number of related themes. The need for a third-party auditable standard on vessels was frequently raised. The at-sea proportion of the supply chain has often been a risk area for human rights abuses, particularly for tuna vessels that operate away from enforcement activities and ports for several weeks at a time. And it can be further amplified in such supply chains, which can be complex and opaque, with processing hubs, transshipment at sea. So you can see here, third-party standard certification was the one that really called itself out as the primary support area. When asked what support was required to achieve the environmental sustainability commitment, responses once again converged around a number of related themes, and these were clearly aligned with the external stakeholder resistance obstacle that I noted earlier. The responses identified support for FIPS and for regional fisheries management actions. And so this suggests that meeting the environmental sustainability commitment by the fishers, processors and distributors is potentially hindered by a lack of support up the supply chain of the FIPS that they're involved in by the customer base and or inaction by the RFMOs. And so again, this is all links back in. So inaction by the RFMOs is stopping the fisheries from having a management plan, which is stopping them being able to declare that they are operating sustainably or at a high performance level, and therefore they're having troubles meeting their commitments themselves. When asked what support is required to achieve the government partnership commitment, the responses converged only around 2 related themes. The collaboration aspect focused on the understanding that individual companies will really struggle to secure policy changes on their own. And the Global Tuna Alliance was actually referred to by several respondees as an example of how companies can address this. And that's great, because it is one of the key the cornerstones of the GTA's work, which is having a collective voice and in making change. Capacity building was the other theme, and this related both to educating companies themselves on the issues, but also how to engage and educate decision makers on and other stakeholders on why these asks are being made. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing we're going to do is develop, I should say, the first thing, it's a tandem process. We're developing 4 toolkits, one for each of the commitments. And you can see here for the traceability one, the magnifying glass, we're going to be focusing on GDST. The Global Tuna Alliance has organizationally endorsed the standards, and we will be providing signposting and support for companies to do the same. to work, firstly, to endorse the standards, secondly, carry out internal assessments of how the standards could be incorporated, and then finally, set a time-bound commitment for actually implementing the standards. For the social responsibility commitment, we're focusing on vessel-based standards because that was the key area that was flagged by people. It's the key weakness. I understand that this is not necessarily seen as the be-all and end-all for social responsibility. We accept that, we know that, but this is about making progress in an area. There are a number of vessel-based standards in development, and we believe that not only can the supply chain support these by endorsing them and making them as part of their seafood sourcing commitments, they can also support them going through GSSI recognition, which is currently in development through the SSCI. So it's a kind of a two-pronged approach there. The environmental sustainability commitment is all going to be based around sourcing policy. So we're using examples of best practice of companies that have excellent sourcing policies in place that is aligned to GSSI recognized benchmarking and credible fishery improvement projects to get to that level of performance that would actually meet the commitment. And finally, for the government partnerships, it's all about engagement support. We're talking about how companies can use existing resources to engage with delegations, but individually and collectively. So there is a real role for organizations like the Global Tuna Alliance to speak on behalf of a number of different companies with regards to effecting policy change. A good example of this is on April the 15th at the next GTA partner meeting, we will be having the attendance remotely of the EU delegation for the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. So this is an opportunity for us to speak as one, as a large proportion of the tuna supply chain in Northwest Europe, to say, you know, this is what we're expecting your position to be at that meeting. To support these areas, we've also been running a series of webinars. These are the ones that have taken place so far. You've got Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. You have the Fishwise Salt Initiative, which is looking at traceability. Fairtrade USA gave a presentation on their capture fishery standard, which ties into the social element. We have the SSCI and the benchmarking they're doing with GSSI. The Responsible Fishing Vessel Scheme. I myself gave a webinar on regional fisheries management organisations and the advocacy that we're doing with them. And finally, one on the Port State Measures Agreement by Pew. You can see here on this awkward looking graphic, you can see how each of these are directly linked to each of the commitments. The sourcing policies, we have a presentation coming from the GSSI team that will be one of the ones there. Other upcoming webinars include a presentation from the FAO on their draft guidance on social responsibility in fisheries and aquaculture value chains. So this is their, the FAO have their guidance on responsible fishing. This is their guidance on social responsibility, which is going to be incredibly interesting to see. We also have a presentation from Fishwise on due diligence in tuna supply chains, which is a part of the social standards. So as well as having vessel-based standard, there's very much room for risk-based approaches as well. We also have a presentation from OPAGAC on their APR scheme, which is or social responsible standard, which is another vessel-based scheme. And finally, Matt Owens from Trimarine is going to be talking about the Seafood Task Force tuna vessel scheme as well. So another opportunity to provide options in the vessel-based standard area. So what are the key findings from all of this? So a lot of information there. These are some of the key findings. First of all, traceability. Significant progress has been made by signatories. But interoperability remains a challenge for companies, a self-identified problem for companies addressing traceability. For social responsibility, while many companies have great systems in place or systems that they're using effectively for on-land proportion of the supply chain, there is a gap for at-sea verification. And this does align with the support required, identified by the respondees, for third-party auditable standards on board vessels. For the environmental one, 23 companies have already made a pledge to source tuna fishery from tuna fisheries that meet the level of performance in the environmental sustainability commitment. And for advocacy, our harvest strategies and harvest control rules are really the only areas where companies have engaged in any significant way. So the key obstacles and support, the obstacles that are really hindering signatories were overall generally external stakeholder resistance or complexity. The support areas required was education and outreach, which addresses the complexity obstacle. So that's a case of signposting, having these webinars, providing resources in an easily accessible way. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We just want to pull them together and make them available. But also industry-led multi-stakeholder initiatives to address these specific issues that are potentially beyond the remit of individual companies. Example being the Global Tuna Alliance. And finally, the progress survey has really revealed that there are clear actions needed to support signatories in meeting or at least progressing towards the commitments in the Tuna Declaration. So the outlook here is we believe meeting the traceability commitment is fully feasible within the 2020 deadline. And our focus for companies is the GDST, which can provide standardized key data elements and the frameworks for the IT systems that are needed. So that's where we're focusing on there. For social responsibility, we believe that significant progress can be made towards meeting it if they actively use third-party standards that are becoming available throughout 2020 for vessels, and to make commitments that they will meet emerging benchmarks, such as the SSCI/GSSI benchmarking exercise. Environmental sustainability, that can be easily achieved if the signatories that haven't yet done it will commit to source tuna from fisheries with third-party certification against GSSI recognized schemes or credible comprehensive FIPS. So that's a pretty straightforward one there. And finally, government partnerships. There has to be individual advocacy. That's a very important part of it, but it needs to, we believe it's got to be done, or it can be done most effectively under the umbrella of coordinated representative activities such as the Global Tuna Alliance or ISSF. We believe this is the most effective way for companies to engage in these areas. It's very complicated. It is difficult. It can feel like a minefield if you're entering it on your own, but there are plenty of people out there who have not only the experience and knowledge of these things, but they also have the resources at hand to push for a particular position or an ask that should be easily supported by you. So at that point, I will pause for breath and open it up for any questions you may have.
Will we be able to get a copy of this presentation?
Absolutely. Yeah, the presentation will be, and the slides and the recording will be made available on the GTA website under documents, but it will also be circulated via email.
Perfect. Thank you. Very good report. Thank you for pulling this together.
Oh, you're welcome. So I've either completely bored you rigid or no one's got any questions, which is great, but feel free to put them in the chat box. Also, if you'd rather have any questions offline, no problem whatsoever, please drop me an email and I'll get back to you one-on-one. It's whatever you prefer, but you know, I'm more than happy to take any questions you may have. No? Okay. Well, I don't want to keep people hanging on. I know everyone must be incredibly busy and people... Oh, sorry, we have a question here. About the benchmarking, can we have some support here? Yes, absolutely. We've had a presentation from SSCI on the activities they are doing with GSSI to do social benchmarking, so benchmark the social standards. So there is a resource there. Very happy to share the link to the slides, but the slides from Thomas are online. But if you'd like to drop me an email, I can send you them directly. I can also put you in contact with Thomas to ask any specific questions. In terms of GSSI, Herman and his team will be giving a webinar. The date we've penciled in is the 6th of April to give you the latest updates on what they're doing, not only how the benchmarking works, what schemes are going through it, any latest developments, but also on a new seafood map project they're doing as well. So that will hopefully provide some information. But if there is anything more, great, brilliant. I didn't recognize your name there. Good, got it. So I'll send you some information on that, Kirsten. Thank you. Also have another question coming in. Why downstream companies feel their supply chains less advanced on meeting commitments than obviously if they're sourcing from these upstream players? Why downstream companies feel their supply chain? Why downstream feel their supply chain less advanced on meeting commitments than upstream if they are sourcing from those upstream players? I think one of the things here is I have the ability to see all the answers of individual companies as well, which is difficult to put because many people requested anonymity. So a lot of this was about the level of accuracy and self-reporting. So it's one of the things you have to go into this is that the way people score themselves does vary both on well, I would probably say it's fair to say individually. There was certain tendency in certain areas to be a little bit more score themselves more harshly, and others score themselves a little bit more flamboyantly, shall I say? And I had to do some editing of it, particularly in areas where I know what's going on. For example, like some of the government partnerships, people say yes, you know, we're fully doing government partnerships. So when you actually drill down into their answers, it's not actually any advocacy they're doing. So it's difficult to be a little bit, it's difficult to be you know, wildly generic in my answer there. It's probably depends on the specifics, but happy to you know, have a conversation with you offline. Any other questions at all? Okay, so the next steps are we have a progress report that contains a lot of this information plus more analysis, plus also best practice highlights from the companies that were happy to share that with everyone, which is fantastic. That report is currently at the designers, and it will be ready potentially at the end of this week, but we're probably more realistically the start of next week. There's also an executive summary report with that, which is just a PDF, but it's not ready for that. It's not designed yet either. The individual dashboards will be circulated to each of the companies that responded to the survey later, as I mentioned, later today or tomorrow, and that will be each of them will receive that. The full report will go out to all the Tuna Traceability Declaration signatories as well. There will be a follow-up survey at the end of the year, probably launched in November, running until January, that will be essentially the final survey. So we'll be finding out how companies have actually performed in meeting their commitments. So there's a real obviously, hopefully, there's a real appetite for the toolkits when how companies can take those next steps. There's a couple of things we've probably learned from this survey that we won't repeat on the next one. Having sort of terms like external stakeholder resistance, we'd like to drill down a little bit more to find out a lot of exactly what companies mean. We've had to do some extrapolation here. But overall, we feel that we've identified the key areas of support from the responses and the conversations we've had. So I will draw everything to a close here then. I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining the webinar, and a big special thanks to Winnie for co-presenting and for all Winnie and her team's support in the progress report. If you do have any feedback or any questions you'd rather ask offline, do not hesitate to email me. There is a recorded version of this. It will be online, and I will be sharing the link as well. The next webinar that the GTA is running takes place on Thursday, the 19th at 4 p.m. UK time again, and that's using a due diligence approach to improving global tuna sourcing, and that's going to be presented by Jen Cole from Fishwise. So I do hope you're able to join us for that one. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely remainder of the day.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone.